This is the One Soldier Podcast, episode 21, with me, Russell Hillier. Alberta separatism, independence, Wexit, whatever you want to call it, Alberta's place in Confederation has never been lower, and its very membership in Canada has been called into question. Now, the issue of Alberta independence has existed for decades. It's been around a long time. But in a poll done last year, an unprecedented 30% of Alberta respondents indicated that they would vote for independence if a referendum was held. And interestingly enough, responses in Saskatchewan were almost identical. And if you think the map of Canada is so set in stone as to make this a preposterous proposition, well, let me draw your attention to Nunavut in 1999, or Newfoundland in 1949. What will the map of Canada look like? How will it change in 10, 20, or 30 years from now? On today's show, I'm joined by Paul Hinman, former MLA, elected 2 times, and currently leader of the Wildrose Independence Party. In this episode, me and Paul are going to talk about face masks, freedom, the fight against globalism, and Alberta independence. Paul Hinman joined me from his home in Alberta, and our conversation starts now. Paul, it looks like you haven't changed in like the last 10 years since I saw you last.
I wish my body said that. My hair's getting thin and my legs are getting weak and my arms are getting weak. And it's
No, you look like you're in fighting form. Good to see you, man.
And you. How is your dad doing with the fight out there? I don't follow him as often as I should, but
it's a lonely fight. It's a lonely fight for freedom. I think that I shouldn't say I think. I know that he's the only elected politician out in Ontario who is, trying to stem the tide of the madness, with the lockdowns, the mask wearing, the blatant abuse of freedom, personal freedoms out there.
It's unbelievable to me, Russ, that we are living through this. And what bothers me the most is just the apathy of most of the people.
Yeah, me too. It's scary. I'm a humanities teacher for junior high school. And so often we learn about historical events, about communism and dictatorial governments. And the question I always try to get the class to answer is, how does this happen? How does a functional society go down that road? And of course, it's always been a theoretical question that there's no answer to, but I think I figured it out. It's fear, isn't it?
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know that it's a theoretical question. It's
not anymore.
Well, even before that, you can argue that we weren't there, but you just know that these snitch lines, the police that have this compliance attitude, and rather than a peace officer and seeing that things are okay, and it's just totalitarianism at its finest.
Well, it is, and it's definitely a slippery road, and think about the propaganda that people have been exposed to for the past 8 months. It's nonstop. I mean, you can't turn on the radio. You can't drive down the road. You can't go to a park without either hearing somebody on the radio or seeing a sign or a billboard reminding you that there's this big problem. And of course, seeing everybody with masks on too, it's a feedback loop, like a self-fulfilling prophecy that
it is
a constant visual reminder that there's a problem and you should be scared.
Yep. So true. And the sad thing is, though, is that those of us who aren't afraid and feel safe, the other ones feel like well, my son, he was actually called, you're a murderer because he wasn't wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And are you kidding me?
Yeah. You want to kill grandma if you don't wear a mask or if you don't buy into the nonsense.
Yep.
And it's interesting too, because at the beginning, everybody, I remember back in the summer, I was in Calgary. You'd go to the grocery store and maybe 1 out of 10 people would have a mask on.
Yeah.
And as soon as I went on vacation, came back about a month later, and the rules had changed, the mask mandates had come in, and then all of a sudden it's 95% of people wearing a mask. And so at the time, you'd go out and you'd see all these people wearing masks, and that they were doing it because the law told them to. but now, because it's so ingrained and entrenched and it's been around for a while now, you don't know if people are doing it because it's the
I,
law or because they agree with it, and so that affects how you approach people as well.
well, it's that false sense of security. And it's kind of interesting because they say that with seatbelts, that people are now actually driving crazier because they have this false sense of security that seatbelts make you safer, and they do, but now they're not practicing good safety. And the same with these masks. I mean, I am just amazed at how many people think that that mask is what's going to prevent this virus from spreading or from them getting it. And that if I'm not wearing one, then that means I am probably the problem
Yeah,
and
you're
going
the
to be the
bad guy.
spreader and the super spreader, and arrest this person, get him out of here.
Yeah. Well, do you think it's people have actually bought into it, or is it just people are wearing it because they think that the other person has bought into it?
I would, and this is pure speculation, but just because of the difference on the way people are responding now, I would say that the majority of people have bought into it, that this mask is their protection and going to save our healthcare system from being overwhelmed and long run. And again, to me, people don't think long term. It's about today or 2 weeks or 4 weeks. That's why we have these so-called, short-term reset, or what do they call them?
The
The
circuit breaker.
circuit breakers. Thank you. I forgot about
Yeah.
the circuit breakers, and it is shocking. but
Yeah.
but they're just they're like you say, they're being conditioned into it 2 weeks at a time, 4 weeks at a time, and not realizing where we've got to. And the fact that, okay, what if a real pandemic, what if this does mutate to something that is actually deadly, and 20 or 30% of the people are going to die because of mutated ones? And the fact that we've spent billions of dollars, I don't know, 25 plus billion provincially, 350 billion federally. Our healthcare system has always been, what would I say, overtaxed,
Yes.
overrun, and we spent nothing to build it up and to get some uh, resilience in it. We're so fragile in it that they want to shut down our society, not realizing if we shut down society, we'll have no money. And when we have no money, we're going to resort back to a third world country and not be able to have the healthcare system that we have. But yet it's all about saving it today. And who could possibly look down the road and foresee that, or to think that a real pandemic could come and we don't need a more robust plan?
Well, that's true. I mean, if you look at the math of what's been spent, we've spent more in, equivalent dollars than we did in World War II. So we've taken on like a World War II level of debt, and what do we have to show for it? Like, at least in World War
Nothing.
II, we got rid of an evil empire.
Yep. No, what we have is a bunch of people that are paranoid of the future and afraid to participate, rather than they came back as freedom fighters and a spirit of we're going to dig in and work. We have nothing, but they built our country for us when they came back. And now we're all hiding behind a desk and think that somebody's supposed to pay us to hide there in safety, not having any understanding of where that money may come from, or that we may lose our country and become a have-not country and no longer part of the G7. But they all say, oh, but everybody else is like this, so
Yeah.
we're still part of the G7.
Everybody's jumped off the cliff. So yeah,
It's
man.
okay.
Well, but you're right though. I mean, the healthcare system. My wife is a nurse, so like I hear this all
Okay.
the time, that the healthcare system is always at capacity. Like there's only like this much room for like leeway. It's
Yep.
always run at the max. And so if any little thing comes along, it can get.
Well, just look historically. If we go back this year, because it's interesting, I've never heard of any red alerts for ambulances this year. But yet, if you go back historically, I talked to one EMR guy the other day, and he says there's been many times where he spent his entire shift waiting in the hallway for the hospital to take their patient. And he says once, maybe twice, he actually finished his shift in that hallway, came back 12 hours later, and had to resume with that patient still sitting in the hallway. And we have paramedics. I mean, it's a crazy system.
I know. I can't help but wonder, and I'm sure you've felt the same way, that if we had devoted like a mere fraction of the cost that we've put into fighting this pandemic, if we had put a fraction of that into healthcare and into long-term care homes,
Yep.
we would be way better ahead.
Oh, yeah. Just think if we spent $2 billion on long-term healthcare beds and $2 billion on another hospital, $4 billion, and then but the operating cost and everything else, that's fine. It's insignificant to the 25 billion
It is.
that we've spent for nothing. It's like putting, I don't know, it's like putting blood into a bleeding person and say we can't suture them up, but we'll keep them alive and just keep adding the blood there. And
yeah, like we have not kept our powder dry for when we
oh,
really might need it. Like you
oh,
said,
we're weaker. We're in a predicament now of if something happens, like I say, if this virus mutates, I mean, what do we do now?
yeah, that's right. That's right. Or if a brand
Oh,
new virus comes
yeah,
along, I mean,
yes,
it's kind of scary to think about like the draconian measures that we've resorted to with this virus, which, you know, I'm sorry to say this, but it has a 99 point whatever percent survival rate. If something much more serious came along, think about what the response of society would be to that. I mean, judging by
yeah.
what we've done with
We,
this.
we do not have a society that could cope with a real pandemic and people dying. Like
No.
people would just be freaking out, and our healthcare system would completely melt down. They don't even comprehend, in my opinion, and know. Like we've got grandchildren and whatnot that are nurses, and no disrespect to them, but they need to go back and watch some of those movies, wartime movies, where wounded soldiers are being just pulled in cots and lined up. And when there's a pandemic, you just do the best you can do in it. You don't say, oh, we're full, you have to die out on the streets, or oh, this way. No, you do flood the rooms, and you
Yeah.
bring in cots. You do what you have to in a pandemic, but you can't build a hospital to say that, well, we need to have enough room for, well, if 25% of people are going to get sick, we need 1 million bed spaces, and spend our money there. I mean, it's just one of those really tough predicaments where, and again, I think that Lieutenant Colonel David Redman, you have a pandemic plan. Like, why don't we have 4 field hospitals that are $1.5 million a piece, in storage to be utilized in a pandemic, and had them set up, and even had our own nurses going and working there rather than shutting down a whole hospital. Like
Yeah.
those are things that true pandemic planners plan for, and you get up and you implement when this hits.
So, Paul, what would a independent Alberta response be to this? Because for those listeners who maybe are not from Alberta and don't know, you are the leader of the Wild Rose Independence Party. In fact, I think that you're the only politician in Alberta to be elected 2 times with 2 different parties in 2 different ridings. So I think you're going to make it a 3rd time as well. But what would an independent Alberta do differently?
Well, first and foremost, we would absolutely recognize, with a constitution, the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And that constitution would actually protect the individual's life, their freedom, their property, and their pursuit of happiness. And to me, a prosperous and free and safe society is only that way if you have a constitution that protects the individual. This idea that this is for the good of society is never good for society. And you talk about the humanities and you go back and teach that, it's always, well, we just need to scourge this group or that group that's bad, or this is the problem. If we get rid of them, if we eliminate them, if we jail them. And this idea that when you ever hear is that this individual or this group needs to be supposedly, I'll use the word sacrifice for the benefit of society, it isn't any good. So you protect the individual. I guess because of the pandemic, let's switch and talk about healthcare, because what we would do is we go back and revert. Central government doesn't work. Doesn't matter whether it's centralized business, centralized healthcare, centralized government. Big government, a long ways from the people, is always a problem, creates all kinds of inefficiencies. There's no entrepreneurialism. There's no trying of something new. Everything has to get okayed by the big boy, and he thinks everything's perfect, or the big person at the top. And so we would actually take the healthcare and we go back to regional healthcare. We would eliminate the global funding, and we'd actually start to pay for services provided. So when somebody came into a hospital, they'd say, wow, this is a client we want. Right now, they see someone that shows up at the hospital as an expense. We've already got our money. If we got to look after this person, it costs us more. We would change, for example, even the emergency room, that when you come through that door, there'd be an immediate greeter there that would ask your name, your healthcare number, and what your problem is, and give you a number so that you could sit down and not have to queue up like a bunch of soldiers waiting to be enlisted and sent off somewhere. There's just so many things that if you back up and focus on service and protecting the people. And again, the last thing that we would ever do is start to decide what is critical or essential services versus not. And you let in a free market and in free people, you let the people exercise the risk that they're willing to take. And if myself or my wife or someone else still wants to go to the gym and exercise, why on earth would the government shut that down and tell those business people that you can't do that? Or a restaurant? You just can't override or eliminate the individual's freedoms. And by allowing that to float freely. And again, the other thing I guess most important that a Wild Rose government would do is we'd actually be looking at the science. I don't know how much you're following COVID, but you look around the world, there's a place in Mexico, Chiapas, that started putting out ivermectin. You go down to Peru, they were early in July, they started giving out ivermectin. You go to India and you see these countries where they immediately recognize the benefit of ivermectin because people were taking that because of the parasites and the problems they have in those tropical countries. And yet we still here are being told by Alberta Health Services that, ivermectin shouldn't be prescribed. We would actually look out around the world. We'd start a task force. I don't know if you've seen Dr. Corey presenting to the Senate a couple of weeks ago, very passionately showing them all the information on the repurposed drugs and to use them for treatment versus they're already, determined safe with the FDA, like hydrochloroquine, zinc, vitamin D. Any of this, what you call the simple solutions, aren't there. And Big Pharma is saying that, we'll come up with this new, vaccine that we've never been able to come up with a vaccine for coronavirus in the past that's been safe and had efficacy, but we'll do it this time if you throw enough money at us. And everything's gone sideways, Russ. It's just unbelievable. Whereas you just need to focus, what's the purpose of government? And so to finish off my long rant, we would actually be looking for all of the information throughout the world and providing that for the people so that informed people can govern themselves and make their own decisions on where they feel safe and what they should do, and not compelling people saying you have to do this or you can't do that. But
it's a good point, though, that the science and the data has been replaced with propaganda. Because if you look at the numbers, it's just people don't want to look at the real numbers because it goes against the official narrative.
Well, just the fact that every day all we hear about is cases. It's not how many are sick. It's not, it has nothing to do with the actual situation. It doesn't talk about the actual number of beds that are available that are here. It doesn't talk about the number. I guess probably the most frustrating thing to me is every day we hear about the number of COVID deaths, but what about the other 160 people who died that day? Are they not relevant? And what are they dying from? Because we're only getting a small percentage. I don't know. In Alberta, we average 2,000 deaths a month historically. And so that's 60 deaths, a day. It's all about the propaganda to create the fear, to create the compliance, to be able to create this really is about the Great Reset and wanting to destroy the Western free market and civilization as we know it. This is a one world government, and boy, are they ever taking advantage of this virus to try and implement it.
Well, and I think if you have an understanding of history and even how politics work, which you do because you've been in this game for a long time, you can sort of see where these roads lead to, and it's not a pretty place.
Nope.
But and so, thanks for being that one guy to stand up.
Well,
I mean, I wish.
Thanks to your dad too. I mean, like there's always those lone wolves that are fighting for freedom, I guess. But I don't know how your dad's doing out in Ontario, but we have a lot of people that are gathering. And again, this will actually push people off of their couches and out of their comfort zone to say, you know what, we've got to stand up for ourselves and for our future and for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, and I know many friends who've gone to those like protests and gatherings.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a needed thing. Paul, what the idea of Alberta independence has sort of been around for a really long time. And I mean, you can think back to the genesis of the Reform Party, the Canadian Alliance, probably even before then too, with the National Energy Program, courtesy of Trudeau Sr. But Alberta independence definitely feels different this time. It feels a lot more, I guess you could say, broad-based. And I'll give you a good example. So, I coach my kids' hockey team, and I will hear
what
parents,
age group?
They're a couple different ages. So under 11 and Timbits hockey, so like novice Timbits.
Yeah.
But you'll hear people in the change rooms, like grandpas changing skates or dads. And they'll talk about Alberta independence like very openly, and sometimes they're joking around, or sometimes it's an off the cuff remark, but it's out there. And further to that, being a teacher, I'm not exactly in the most conservative environment, but still, and I don't want to overblow things and make it seem like there's a majority of teachers who think this way, but I've got a number of colleagues who, if you ask them, they would say, oh yeah, I would vote Wexit tomorrow, or I would vote in Alberta independence. Yeah. So it's out there, and definitely more broad-based than it was before. What do you think is the reason behind that?
We are hurting more than we've ever hurt since the dirty 30s. And in the dirty 30s, the Eastern elites pulled out. They pulled the banks away. They says there's nothing out there worth saving. We're not going to worry about them. But now, I want to say the two biggest things that are propelling this is, one, is the economy, but two is the political policies that are focused at shutting down and hurting Alberta. And whether you want to even take such a far off look at employment insurance and realizing that Albertans are subsidizing every other province's employment insurance up until recently. And you just case after case, the pension plan, Alberta subsidizes all the other Canadians on that. And we're hurting, and we're giving the bully our lunch money, hoping that he's going to give us some lunch back, and he just laughs and walks away and says, you're on your own, you don't deserve to eat. And that's the way many Albertans are looking. They're realizing now the resentment that Ottawa and Trudeau and others have to us and our industry, because a lot of people think it's just the industry, but it isn't. Even if they were to shut down the oil and gas and we rebounded and or innovative in agriculture and technology and stuff, they would still focus policies at extracting the maximum out of us that they could and keep us beholden to them.
Yeah, and just some of those numbers that you're talking about, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's on average $20 billion a year in that Alberta
That's called a membership fee.
The membership fee of Confederation.
Yes.
Well, it's really, think about what we could do with $20 billion of our own money that we could keep each year.
But not only that, I would argue the other 20 billion, and there's a total of 50 billion, and they figure that we get 10 billion back kind of for healthcare, and that's our own mess and not doing well. But the other 20 billion of services, I think that we could probably do it at half of that, at 10 or 15 billion, and provide much better services for Alberta than what the federal government does in their so-called, what services are they giving us for the other $20 billion?
I don't know, bilingualism.
Bingo.
It's really it's almost like a colonial attitude.
It is. It absolutely is.
And it's been going on for a long time, hasn't it? I mean, once I started looking into the history of a Western separatism and whatnot, well, first of all, you come across that old, you've probably seen this, that old cartoon
with the cow.
Yeah, and so that's just as relevant as it is today.
Our museum, oh, when was that? 2015, 16. Our local museum here at the Galt Museum they put up a great display of the dirty 30s. And yeah, they had the people there milking the cow and getting dumped on in the East. But I was shocked at how relevant it was a few
Yeah.
years ago. And now it's full circle.
It totally is, and I think there's as someone who I sort of like have two perspectives on this because of course I've lived in Alberta for I think about 15 years now, and my four kids have been born here. But being from Ontario, and I still go back there from time to time, but I sort of see both sides of the
Yeah.
mindset. And what I don't know if Albertans realize this, but the Eastern mindset or attitude towards Alberta is not a good one. It's very, if you say Alberta is in the East, it's almost like a pejorative term.
Yep.
And a lot of it is based on like stereotypes that aren't really relevant anymore. But I think there's this belief in Ontario and in Quebec that, oh, Alberta's rich. And so it's their privilege to, like you said, pay the membership fee of Confederation.
Don't most of them deny that we're even contributing to anything extra? Like I don't know. Like when you listen to the premiers from Quebec and Ontario and stuff, they act like, and again, Ontario has contributed in the past, not always a have-not province, but they just totally deny that they're being subsidized.
Yeah, well, and I think Quebec especially
Yeah,
will
Quebec.
deny
Yeah,
that.
they're the elephant in the room. Come on.
But you won't hear it though in Ontario. For instance, if you're in Calgary and you turn on the radio, you're going to hear about Western alienation, independence. You're going to hear about the equalization imbalance. In Ontario, you'll never hear anything about that on the news. And I think actually it would be a huge surprise to most people in the East, if I can call it that up to 30% of Albertans would vote for separatism. And those are numbers from polls that were done a while ago. But that would be shocking to most people in Ontario because they'd be like, what? There's people talking about separatism in Alberta? What's going on here? Because they don't know. They're not being told the truth. No, it's just interesting how the role that the media plays in covering stories and pushing a narrative, because it would be surprising to most people across the country. And if you're listening to this program in Ontario or Quebec, this isn't to bash anybody, but just
No,
the idea in Alberta is that, well, economically, it would make a lot of sense to go it our own way, because
and it's not even economically. We have a different entrepreneurial spirit out here where you get out and you perform and merit counts. Where I'm sorry that I can't say I've done anything besides visit out east, but they have a very socialist mindset with this idea of the good for society, do these things for the group. And they've, whether you want to say been raised, been educated, the propaganda, they think that socialism is fine, or that majority should rule. And that's something else I should say, that majority rule is no different than tyranny by the majority, is no different than tyranny of the one. And that's one of our problems with the Canadian Constitution. It very much allows for that, for the 7 wolves to vote and say, well, we're going to take the lambs from the 5 sheep. And that's perfectly legal and legitimate. And they say, well, we need them for our kids. And they don't think anything of where they're taking it from them or why they're taking it. Just they're the majority, so they can. And I also use the analogy quite often that, wherever you live, you kind of think you're the center of the universe. And so if you live in Toronto, you kind of think that is Canada. You don't even think of Ontario, rural Ontario. You're there looking and you're the focus. And then if you get to rural Ontario, you see Toronto as the center of the universe, but you forget about what's behind you. And each time you go further out, and when you're out at Pluto, you see all the planets between here and there, and you recognize them. But when you're that planet closest to the sun or the center of government, you forget anything that's behind you. And I used to, when I was in the legislature and I had to sit beside Rachel Notley and Brian Mason, that they were always talking about these people with so much money and that it should be taken away and redistributed. And I used to always say, well, what you fail to realize is if you're on the economic ladder of the world, you're part of that 97%, and you should look behind. And if you think that it should be redistributed, well, then you should start sending your money, and you should start going to India or Africa or these, South American countries. And that's where I say that people don't realize who are behind them. They only see who's in front of them, and they're jealous and think that they should get it, only to turn around and look down and realize that, wow, 90% of the people are still behind me, and their majority vote could take everything that I have. But anyways, it's just interesting how people and the Easterners, their perspective is very different than someone who's on the outside.
Yeah, well, and that is just I think what you're talking about there is a complete lack of perspective.
Oh.
There's a lot of people in Alberta who I think when they think about Alberta's interests and, the idea of separation, they sort of, historically anyways, they've looked to Jason Kenney as being like the great defender of Alberta and the man who's going to put Trudeau in his place and stand up for our interests. But we haven't really seen that happen, have we? Like, we've seen a lot of angry rhetoric from the Jason Kenney government. But what's your take on that? Like, is he the guy who's able to stand up?
There isn't a person that I was more excited to support and get in there and thought, wow, we've got us a real general here who's going to look after Alberta. And with your greatest expectations and hopes come your greatest disappointments. And I have to say, it's been the biggest disappointment. And I love to go back to the scenario of TC Energy's Nova Gas Transmission Limited expansion line here in Alberta, that they spent 2 years meeting all the rules and regulations of the old National Energy Board, updated to meet Trudeau's new Canadian energy regulator, which had a lot more conditions in order to get a pipeline built inside Alberta. But the Canadian energy regulator actually gave the okay for that on the 19th of February 2020, a time when we desperately needed jobs. And Kenney promised three big things for me. Is he promised jobs, pipelines, and to fight Ottawa. And here is a pipeline inside our provincial boundaries being regulated by Ottawa. And instead of being able to go ahead on the 20th of February this spring, when we desperately needed the $1.4 billion invested, we needed the 5,500 jobs, it got hijacked with the new bill. And I can't remember the name of the bill, was Bill 61 or whatever. But anyways, bottom line is that after it's gone through the regulator, it has to go through a political 90 days of cabinet to see, is there anything that we should be adding to this from the political side? Bad enough to have to go through the regulations, but now you got Trudeau and his cabinet looking at it. And after the 90 days, so on the 19th of May, they should have had to rule and say, yeah, you can go ahead, or here's the conditions. They hijacked it for another 150. And so like 240 days later, on the 19th of October, 2020, Trudeau comes out, here's the new conditions, and they put 5 more conditions, which the Canadian Energy Regulator soundly refuted and says, no, those aren't good conditions. Well, the politicians in cabinet put them in there. 2 of them are open-ended, where you don't even know what the costs are going to be. And what did Jason Kenney and Sonia Savage do? Oh, we're so excited that we've got the approval. We'll help TC Energy meet all these new rules and regulations, and we're just so glad that this came through. When back on the 20th of February, he should have said, you know what, Ottawa, this is none of your business. We're going ahead with this. But TC Energy, being a Canadian company, is very cognizant that, well, we can't upset Ottawa because we need other areas outside of Alberta. So I understand their point, but our premier should have been standing up and saying, no, you back off. We're building this expansion line. It's not a new pipeline. It's an expansion line like Trans Mountain. And we're going through all of this hassle. But anyways, I just fear, they figured there's another $2 billion that was probably going to be spent because this pipeline was going to open up and have expansion room. And that all got thwarted for this winter's work. And it's been a repercussion. But no, Jason hasn't done anything to protect us. He hasn't done anything for jobs, and he's done very little for pipelines, and has been to our detriment. And to make matters worse, he sat on the stage with his good buddy Aaron O'Toole and says, oh, we're just not making the progress in the environment that we need to make. We just got to chew our gum better as we're walking, and we'll get there. Well, I'm sorry, but even even with Rachel Notley and her so-called social license and the carbon tax and everything else, it's not about social license. This is about animosity, jealous and anger. And these people would cut the hand that feeds them just out of spite and ignorance, because they don't understand that this is some of the best oil in the world. We have the best environmental laws, the best labor laws, the best human rights legislation, and yet they want to get their oil from conflict regions and tyrannical governments and send our money there. It's just unbelievable, Russ, to me. And that's why Albertans are finally realizing that these people in Ottawa are not our friends, and they want to hurt us, and they want us to be a have-not province.
Yeah, and of course, when you're a have-not province, then you're very easily controlled that way, and that's sort of,
Absolutely.
yeah, and that gets back to what you were talking about, like the Alberta spirit has always been one of entrepreneurialism, independence, and
Yeah.
if you can get a province addicted to handouts, then you lose that spirit.
And
But
hasn't Jason already shown that that's his spirit? He's begging for handouts and please send us more. And then he's stomping his feet and pounding his hands that we're not getting the $6 billion that we need, instead 237 million or some measly amount.
yeah, and I think you got it when you're thinking about this. Like you got to consider that he's a man that has federal ambitions, and so if he's
Yeah.
going to lead the federal Conservative Party, I mean I think that's where he wants to be eventually. He can't alienate the rest of the provinces, and so there's this like where does the loyalty lay? Like, is it to your province or is it to the rest of the country that you'll need
Yeah.
to potentially get to the top dog position?
And again, what most people don't realize, and they should, because we've contributed over $600 billion in the last few years into Confederation, that a healthy Alberta makes for a healthy Canada. But no, that's not it. They want their star player on their team to be limited on the time on the field. They want them to have if I use a hockey analogy, they want us to go out and play with a 4-inch hockey stick and compete in the world, when the rest get a full stick and they get to sharpen their skates and we're not allowed to.
Yeah, it's definitely like an unfair
Yeah.
advantage. There was also, like, I remember before this pandemic started, there was independence rallies being held with, like, 500
Yeah.
people packing arenas. These were like crowds that were very, very large and significant. There was also this there was the Maverick Party it was Wexit, and
Yeah.
then it morphed into this thing called the Maverick Party, which always to me seemed like a really I don't know, seemed like a dumb name for a party. But where have they been? Because they have been missing in action for 6 months, if not longer. They're supposed to be Alberta's representative, sort of like the Bloc Québécois.
Yeah. When you look at what they put out, that they've said these are MPs that are going to go out to Ottawa purely in Alberta's interest or Western Canada's interest, because they are a Wexit group, meaning Manitoba West. But I don't know how many. I mean, the lion's shares they're going to get elected will probably be from Alberta, then Saskatchewan, and maybe some of northern BC. But they're going out there purely to represent the interest of the West. But realize in this flawed majority rule system, you can go out there and squawk all you want. You might be able to slow some things down, but you can't stop or turn anything around. And that's why you need a provincial party that's actually about protecting Alberta, standing up, putting our house in order. And again, when you said, what would a Wildrose government do? You asked about the pandemic, but there's 6 things that we really need to do in my mind in order to reestablish ourselves as a strong and free society. But number 1 is that we need to create the Alberta Revenue Agency, and we need to collect all of the taxes here in Alberta by Albertans, and then we will scrutinize the federal programs and what needs to be funded and what isn't. And yes, that'll be a legal battle. I get all of that. And we could play nice in the sandbox for a year or whatever, just so we get everything set up and functioning right. Number 2, though, we need our own police force. Last thing we need is for Trudeau. And again, we have enough trouble with our own police force, especially with the COVID stuff. And you look at that. But you need your own police force, and not Ottawa saying, hey, I want this gun grab. It hasn't even passed through legislation, but he could send out the RCMP tomorrow to go collect what is now prohibited weapons, according to Justin Trudeau. So, and again, that they have no regard for rural Alberta. They don't police it properly. And again, what we have here, and it's quite evident, especially after this COVID things, that they're more worried about compliance and the people respecting them and protecting, I want to call the perpetrator, and the victim is just almost ignored in our current system. So with the police, we need to upgrade our justice system to where we're actually protecting the individual and the victim, and we're putting these perpetrators away into reform camps or whatever, and not allowing them to run freely. But Canada Pension, we need an Alberta pension plan. It should be like Quebec and those other ones. We should have billions of dollars in an Alberta pension plan, and we don't. We send out an extra, 2.7, $2.9 billion of the Canada Pension Plan that could actually be building a fund that's fully funded instead of all of this unfunded liabilities that we have. Employment insurance, another area where, again, it's ridiculous that Alberta workers are subsidizing all the other workers on their insurance. We need to, in 1930, we became what I call a third-class citizen to a second-class citizen because they passed the Resource Transfer Act, and Alberta then became owners of the resources and the land. We need an Environmental Act now because, no pun intended, but the Environmental Act has trumped the Resource Act, and we don't have control of our resources now. And we need to just tell Ottawa, look, you can impose whatever restrictions you want on your economy and your people, but here in Alberta, we know how to keep our land and our water and our air clean and pure. We'll have our own Environmental Act. And then the other one, though, is immigration policy, that we just need to get a handle on that and go back to what it used to be, where you had family and business sponsorship of people. And probably most important, though, when we've had a foreign worker here for 2 years, they've been working, they have a job, they haven't got in trouble, why are we sending them out of our country? Those are the people that should be first on our list to be able to claim residence and to become an Alberta citizen.
So, Paul, what you're saying is in independent Alberta is not going to be having police tasering kids playing hockey, and we get to keep more of our money. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. One of our my goal with the new constitution, there's two things that I see that causes, I love Churchill's old saying, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. But let's look at democracy and what are the problems that causes it to fall apart. Number one is usually fiscal irresponsibility of big government, and they start running big debts and get into financial trouble. But the worst of it is that by not having to balance your books every year, you can buy votes with our children and grandchildren's money. And so a constitution needs to say, outside of true emergencies, and whether that's a fire, earthquake, or whatever it might be, certainly not a little virus that kills 800 people in a year's time, but you have to balance your books. And if in fact you spent $10 billion more, like Trudeau did his first year, it's actually turned out, I think, to 20 or 30 billion, well, taxes all go up the next year, just like municipal government. And we need to be able to balance that. And then government can't buy votes from other people because they're expecting them to pay next year. And the other problem that we have is accountability. And you know how passionate I am about recall. You just absolutely have to be able to fire your elected people. It's very simple to me. 50% plus one of the total number of people who vote in the last election, if they sign a petition, you're out of there. And the last one that goes along with recall and accountability is citizens initiative referendums that are binding, and people can bring them forward and do that. But no, an Alberta that puts its house in order and then lets the people in a referendum decide whether they want to stay or go, it's the only hope, in my opinion, for our children and grandchildren.
Well, I think that's like a lot of just common sense policy that you're talking, and I think that a lot of Albertans will be really amenable to that message. Hey, Paul, do you think that Ottawa would, and the Laurentian elite, do you think that they would just let the goose that lays the golden egg walk away?
The real question is can they stop us from walking away? And, it's an interesting point. We're spending an extra $20 billion a year for our membership fee. Do you know how much it costs to operate the Canadian military?
It should be a lot more than what they're spending, but I take your point.
It's actually, depending on how you calculate it, but anywhere from 15 billion to 21 billion. We could actually, with all of the money we have, hire the Canadian military and say, hey, we're going to fund you. I mean, we got two of the biggest bases. We've got a lot of military here, and so I mean, the question is where would the loyalty lie? What can you do? But I just, first of all, when you have a prime minister that thinks that budgets just balance themselves, and he spends like a drunken sailor, or worse, a Saudi prince who just has money that he wants to throw around the world and be lavish and, hey, look at me, aren't I wonderful? What, they don't even know where the money's coming from. They're in denial of it. So I don't know that they realize how much is coming from us. And it's even like our own freedoms with this COVID. You don't realize what you have until you lose it. And so I don't think they're smart enough to realize they're going to lose anything if we were to leave, and we'll be all set up and running well before they kind of wake up to realize that, oh, who's going to put the fuel in my car? Where's the fuel in my car going to come from?
Right.
I don't see a problem from them. They're so arrogant and full of themselves. I just don't see it, but we'll cover ourselves just to make sure.
Yeah, and I mean also just from a geopolitical sense, we've got America next door who aren't going to let. Chances are they're not going to let any funny business happen on their border. So that would definitely.
The scary thing on that though, Russ, right now is whether Biden becomes part of this new America. Because if Biden's in there, to me, he's maybe even further down the road than Trudeau on world globalism. And you look at his connections with China, you look at the Chinese troops that are here, and Biden's connection with China. I'd be very fearful if Biden's in there and Trudeau together. I think that will actually accelerate the independence movement here in Alberta.
Yeah, and that's something that I've never really like. I know there's this like segment of the independence movement, a small one, who advocate for Alberta joining America, and I just don't think that's a good. Like, we wouldn't be any better off. I mean, we're already beholden to Ottawa. Why would we want to be beholden to New York and Washington?
Yeah,
Doesn't
well,
make any sense.
we're a little fish in a big pond, and what we'd be there is almost a little fish out of the water and flopping around. That no, why I don't see any benefit in that. And the other interesting thing too, though, is Alberta, is that we actually can and will negotiate free trade with countries that have our values and our regulations and whatnot, because we don't need to protect the auto industry. We don't need to protect the dairy industry. All of these things that causes us rift with America are not problems here in Alberta. And so we can actually sit down there, open up the border, and actually create free trade with them and many other countries around the world.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Hey, Paul, last question. We're coming to the end of 2020. If you can look into your crystal ball, when do you think this is going to happen? Because personally, when I look at the grand scope of history, I truly do believe that Alberta will probably separate from Canada at some point. And I mean, you can look at a map of Canada throughout the ages, and the map is always changing. Borders are always changing. There's different provinces, territories being added and renamed and conglomerated. So there's no question that the map of Canada, in 20, 50 years, 100 years is going to look different than it does today. But when do you think Alberta is going to actually be on its own as a free country?
Well, I would, at this point in the way things have accelerated, I would say if we don't form government in 2023, it'll be another 50 or 80 years again. We'll become a have-not province and won't be in a position to become independent. And so for me, 2023 is critical. And then we will have a vote within the next 2 years of forming government. So 2025, I think that Alberta can be free. And I think by 2030, it will be the freest, most prosperous nation in the world. But again, I don't dispute for a minute that as we go to be independent, we may have a few tough years. I don't necessarily see that, but you still have to prepare for that. And that's what kind of scares Albertans. And that's why I talk about putting our house in order.
Well, Paul, we're going to have really tough years if we don't do anything.
Oh, absolutely. But then you become, but it's one thing Like right now, we still have things going. But again, I mean, if a new virus comes out and they shut us down for another 6 months or another year because a new mutant virus or a new one comes out, we like I say, we could easily be tipping into a have-not province. And then Albertans will say, well, we need to stay. But my promise or my predictions to Albertans, if we don't get out and they vote next fall about the equalization, Ottawa by then will say, yeah, we're happy to look at equalization because you guys are so poor and broken, you're not contributing anymore. So we might as well get rid of equalization. You're right, we don't need it. And so when we're in that broken and dysfunctional state, don't be looking to Ottawa thinking they're going to be sending out money now any more than they did in 1930. They'll be laughing at us and say it serves you right. And they're even saying that about COVID. You've got the premiers and other political leaders saying that we don't deserve any extra help during this COVID dilemma.
Yeah. One thing that we do on this podcast is one of the themes, I guess you could say, is how me and my guests, we often look at how history moves really, really slowly, 99% of the time. And then for that brief moment of time, it goes very quickly. So, I think if people are listening to this and sort of laughing about the idea of Alberta independence, I don't think you should be laughing. I think it's definitely a possibility. Who knows? Maybe it's something that will happen in the next 5 years. My prediction, if it means anything, is I think that I think Paul, you guys are going to win seats. I especially like in rural Alberta, you're going to get on the board, and I think that's just a matter of time. And I'm going to wish you luck with that.
Yeah, well, minimum what we want to do is to be on the playing field with a minority government where we're holding the balance of power, and we can stop this craziness.
Paul, I'm going to leave it at that. It's been really nice talking to you and really nice seeing you again.
And you, Russ, you take care.
And that concludes my conversation with Paul Hinman, former MLA and leader of the Wild Rose Independence Party in Alberta. On this podcast, I've always gone out of my way to avoid talking to politicians because we all know that they speak in sound bites, couch their words, and never really tell you what they truly believe. But I made an exception for Paul Hinman. He's a guy who never shies away from open and honest conversation, and I hope you liked it. At the beginning of this episode, I also asked you to think about what the map of Canada might look like in the future. Will Alberta be a part of it? Will BC? Saskatchewan? Once those dominoes start falling, will there even be a Canada? If you liked today's episode, do me a favor and subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel. Share it with your friends and family too. Leave a review. At this moment, I'm going to give a big thanks to some of the new subscribers to the show, and I'm talking to you, Timo, Lil Boy, Sarge0351, Thermopylae 2007, to name just a few. Gentlemen, thank you for your support. And finally, I'm going to dedicate this episode to everyone out there fighting the good fight on lockdowns and mask mandates. Big actions and small. Don't give up. That's it. That's all. Out.